So I'm here on Coffee with Cornelius with David Bird, an emeritus professor of wildlife biology at McGill University and director of its Avian Science and Conservation Center. We are talking about birds on this episode. If you like this content, hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more. Professor Bird is an ornithologist, an expert on birds, and has appeared widely in the media. If you're an avid Canadian bird watcher, then you may know of his popular book, Birds of Canada. Professor Bird has been active in the conservation of birds, and that's what we're going to talk about today. In particular, how are changes to the Canadian economy affecting birds. We'll talk a little bit about evolution and evolutionary ecology of birds. And Dr. Bird, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Cornelius.
So I have to ask you this. How often do people like to point out the fact that your name is Bird and your subject of study is also birds?
Almost every time, and you're no exception.
Oh my goodness.
What I tell people basically is that it was just dumb luck that I happened to have the last name Bird, and I ended up studying birds all my life. Don't get me wrong, I love it. It makes it easy for people to remember it. And I love when I give a lecture to little children, and I ask them, I said, do you think I'd change my name to suit what I'm doing? And they almost all think that I have. I can't believe the guy named Bird. I've been the subject of 2 or 3 books about people's names who match their professions. I've made it into 2 or 3 of those books over the years.
There are books with people's names that match their professions.
I wish I could remember what the phenomenon's called. There's a name for this sort of thing where people's names reflect their professions, and I can't remember off the top of my head.
That's fascinating. So where are you right now, Dave?
Well, you've actually caught me in the lovely little mountain town of Fernie, BC, which is in the East Kootenays, southeastern part of BC, about 3 hours from Calgary, just north of Kalispell, Montana. It's famous for its skiing mostly, but it's becoming very famous also for fly fishing, for cutthroat trout, which I adore doing, and also for mountain biking, which my son absolutely lives and breathes here. And the reason I'm here is because I'm celebrating basically the week birthday of my first grandchild, whose name is Lachlan Angus Bird. Can you tell that my son is partnered with a Scotswoman?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, that's the very Scottish name.
Yes.
So congratulations, by the way. That's
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're very pleased to be here, and we're basically helping them get through the first few weeks of childhood, and then we'll be coming back probably again in late August, and probably every year this time for sure.
That's awesome. It's great news. My own parents were very thrilled when we had our firstborn, our daughter.
Yeah.
So I've got a question for you. What made you interested in ornithology? I mean, was it your name that kind of drew you to it, or what was it something separate?
Actually had nothing to do with it, Cornelius. I got interested in birds through it indirectly when I was just a young, interested in hunting and fishing, and I wanted to be a falconer. I wanted to have a trained falcon and catch things. And so I got really into birds of prey, got momentarily diverted by fast cars and girls and money, and actually even tried to pursue a degree in automotive engineering to design racing cars.
Awesome.
But realized that I have no brains to be an engineer. I was very unhappy. I went back to my roots, which was wildlife, and birds of prey were in trouble because of DDT thinning their eggshells. And they were in the news a lot, and I wanted to do something to help them. So I went to the University of Guelph the following year and took a zoology degree, and basically from there went to McGill University, where I got accepted into a master's program to study artificial insemination of birds of prey. I take great pride in telling people that I was the very first person in the world to produce a falcon from artificial insemination, and then later on a falcon from frozen thawed semen using artificial insemination.
Whoa, that's pretty cool.
All of these things were using the American kestrel, which was then a very, very common bird, as a surrogate species to help peregrine falcons, which were a highly endangered bird. And so I basically managed to convince the dean at Macdonald College that I was worth keeping around. And so I was attracting a lot of students because I enjoy doing exactly what we're doing right now, public outreach, and I was attracting students to the wildlife program, which became very, very strong later on. And so he basically hired me long enough, and then I got a lucky break. A lot of professors were retiring from universities, so the federal government came up with a new program to install young professors in universities by what a kind of a fellowship program. And then after 5 years of kind of federal money, then the university have to decide, do we keep them or do we cut them loose, or her loose? And in my case, they decided to keep me, and then the rest is history. I ended up becoming a professor and studying birds of prey for 40 years there. I retired in 2013. Always had a love for the mountains and the ocean. Montreal didn't quite offer that. Montreal is a great city, don't get me wrong, and I go back there as much as I can, but the British Columbia was just such a large attraction to me and my wife, and we moved to Sydney in 2013, and there I fish for halibut and salmon and crabs and prawns, and I hunt deer on Sydney Island, an invasive species, fallow deer there, and basically love the lifestyle.
And the weather is just beautiful there. I think it's perfect
Oh
weather.
gosh,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I have to say though that the weather patterns have changed in the winter. In the first 3 winters, it was great. Lots of sunshine, not quite as bad, rainy and gray as Vancouver, but suddenly, because perhaps climate change, I don't know what's going on, things are now much more like Vancouver. So my wife and I just got lucky break and bought a very modest little 3-bedroom place down in Baja near La Paz. And so we go there every winter now, and I started up the Baja Birding Club there. It's a club with no rules, no fees, nothing. You just go bird watching with me, and I like it very much. And along those lines, it's rather ironic that you're contacting me today, because I just finished bird watching up at a place called Island Lake Lodge, which is a beautiful, beautiful lodge up in the mountains, in the Lizard Mountain Range. And I discussed with them the possibility of a sort of bird festival with talks and bird trips all over the place. And I've now done a lot of that and realized the value of this place.
That's fantastic. That's really great. And Canada's, I think, one of the great draws of Canada for a lot of people, and BC in particular, but also all of Canada really has this.
Oh yes,
is our natural beauty, right? I mean, whatever you want in Canada, you can get it. Dense, beautiful forests, a lot of ocean, a lot of rivers, and Arctic tundras even have their beauty to them.
Well, we have 35 million people in a country that's huge.
Yeah.
And we're only living in a very small part of it, so that leaves a lot left over for wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great thing. But, at the same time, our economy depends crucially on natural resources. We have oil, we have natural gas. If you go up to Northern Ontario or parts of, I think, the Northwest Territories, you're going to get gold and diamonds and so on.
Sure.
So our pride as a nation comes from our natural beauty. But at the same time, our jobs come from natural resources. So how do we balance a vibrant economy with conservation concerns?
Well, Cornelius, it's not an easy thing to do, and I'm just as much in favor of progress as the next person. I'm hoping that we're getting past the fossil fuels thing, and maybe the COVID pandemic is teaching that we can get by and look at what a nice world we have when we don't have cars and planes and so on, and maybe that's the way to go. But I also do recognize that societies all across Canada, from the fishermen in Newfoundland to people in Alberta who have that oil they want to get out, I do understand that there are markets out there. If there are markets out there for it, as long as it's done responsibly, I'm not for wanton destruction of natural habitats just to do whatever you need to do to make money. It has to be with the responsible extraction of minerals, responsible damming of rivers, and so on. If it's not done that way, then and it's just nothing but greed, then I think we're all in trouble.
I would agree. Something that I do have a question about is, in particular, 5G, and this is something that has come up a lot now. I mean, 5G has sparked a huge debate politically, but I'm not really interested in the politics of it. Scientifically, I'm interested in its effect on birds. Does 5G harm birds? And what I mean by that, does it harm them not only in the fact that the birds crash into the cell towers, which I think probably happens, but does it interfere with the birds' internal navigational systems?
Well, you ask a very important question, and in preparation for this interview, I looked up 5G power. I knew a little bit about it, and I've heard about the accusations that it may cause brain tumors in humans, because there are people that already believe that we use our cell phones and we're all going to die of brain tumors, and that hasn't quite panned out, at
No.
least to my knowledge. Everybody
I hope
still
not.
uses it quite a bit.
Yeah.
Now, my feeling is I tried to find some scientific evidence on the internet, some scientific papers that have been published in peer-reviewed journals showing that 5G power has impacts on birds, and I could not find anything.
Hmm.
All I could find was websites dedicated to denigrating 5G power and saying that, oh, because several hundred birds fell out of the sky in The Hague over in the Netherlands, and there was a tower, 5G tower just put up, it must be that caused it. Maybe
Oh.
it was, but I'd like to see some scientific evidence. And until I see not just one, not even just two published papers, but enough papers out there that pretty much damn it, then I'll join the chorus and say, hey, maybe the world's not good for 5G, at least the way it's being presented, because it kills wildlife and may hurt human health. I actually worked on electromagnetic radiation at McGill University. See, when I was
Cool.
there for my 40 years, I had an American kestrel colony. It's a tiny little falcon, beautiful little thing, actually in trouble now. And I bred them in captivity. I had a colony of about 300 to 400 of them, and we would do research on them. Some of it was research like behavior, ecology, and nutrition, genetics, that sort of thing. But a lot of it was toxicology. We used them to, for example, look at how DDT caused the thin eggshells. We
Hmm.
looked at things like fluoride. We looked at flame retardant chemicals and so on. And I had a PhD student, Kim Fernie, who's now a very well-known toxicologist around the world for birds and other wildlife. And she studied electromagnetic radiation. We just happened to fall into something where we had a very large cow barn that had specially it was specially prepared to do studies on effects of electromagnetic radiation on cows because they grazed below power lines, right?
Right.
And so we actually had some kestrels breeding in cages being exposed to those electromagnetic waves and compared to controls. And the results, to be honest with you, were quite messy. In fact, we found some rather strange things, like they produced bigger eggs and had better fertility when they were
Oh.
exposed to the EMFs, as we call them, than when they
Yeah.
were not. But on the other hand, one thing did stand out at the end is that the electromagnetic radiation did have an impact on things like on the so-called jet lag hormone.
Well, what's the jet lag hormone?
I'm having a senior's moment right now, and oh God, what the heck is the name of the hormone? That it's the one you take pills of to overcome jet lag. Dieldrin.
Okay, right, yeah.
Anyway, the bottom line is that it had an impact on that particular hormone.
So, conceivably, then, I know there's an absence of scientific evidence, but this isn't necessarily evidence of absence. And what your experiments would suggest is that ostensibly there might be an effect. At least there is a mechanism there that could be
Mm-hmm.
acting in 5G. So, if that's
Sure.
the case, is it fair to say maybe that, hey, 5G should be stalled until more science is done to conclusively show that it
Sure.
has or doesn't have an environmental
Yeah.
effect?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't argue against that for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, just the very fact, if you take DDT, for example,
Hmm.
just because it killed mosquitoes and other agricultural pests and that sort of thing, we just dashed right into it and started producing it
Yeah.
and spraying it everywhere. And then we found out that it caused, impacts on wildlife and stayed out there for a half-life of 50 years. And then we got rid of that because of the fact that it was staying on in the environment too long and came up with the organophosphates. And without testing those properly, we started spraying those things all over the place.
Hmm.
And they started showing to be extremely toxic.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is, in the end, they don't get banned necessarily because they cause impacts on wildlife. It's because they eventually have impacts on humans.
That's right.
And so that becomes the deciding factor. So yeah, no, I'm not. I don't think the world should rush headlong into 5G power until studies are being done. And I'm almost certain that there are ornithologists out there in the world right now who are doing exactly that and doing studies of the effects of 5G power on birds. It's just that I haven't seen their papers yet, and it usually takes a lag time of about 1 to 2 years from the day you conceive a study to the day it gets published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Sure. And, frankly, a lot of this is about costs and benefits, right? Like you've, I think, alluded to already with the economy. Something that I do wonder about, too, is whether efforts at conservation and getting off fossil fuels might do more harm than good. In particular, in the case of wind turbines. When it
Mm-hmm.
comes to wind turbines, we hear that they kill thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of birds every year. Is it worthwhile to consider wind turbines as an alternative source of energy in light of what they do to bird populations?
Well, the fact is that I have studied wind turbines as well. I've been involved as a consultant in wind turbine populations or wind turbine impacts on birds, and they actually don't have as big an impact on birds as you would think. In
Okay.
fact, a fairly good study that was done by some friends of mine in the States showed that only an average of 6 to 7 birds per turbine per year are
Oh,
killed.
okay. That's not too bad.
No, it's not. I wouldn't say that let's stop wind turbines because they kill birds. Now, on the other hand, if you put a wind turbine field on a major migration path of, say, water birds, like aquatic birds, or some major migration path, like somewhere right beside Point Pelee, for example, which is a famous migration thing,
Hmm.
that wouldn't be a good idea because you're putting birds in harm's way. But
Yeah.
the fact is that many of the larger birds, the birds of prey, which a lot of people think get sliced and diced by the turbines, in fact will avoid turbines. It's just that the famous case that everybody quotes for wind turbines is the Ultimate Pass in California, where they built these lattice-type wind turbines. When I say lattice, it means the stands are lattice-like. They're not just a stem, a smooth stem. They're a lattice where the
Oh,
birds
I
can
see.
perch on them. And they built these turbines, hundreds and hundreds of them. I've seen them myself in fields where all kinds of bird of prey food was living. And so they basically created a huge killing field. And they killed off a lot of hawks and eagles and so on.
That's
So
horrible.
everybody quotes that particular study, but
Yeah.
not all wind turbine fields are bad. And the fact is, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, we got to get off these fossil fuels, but gee, we can't use wind turbines because they kill bats in particular. That's the big worry about them.
Oh, okay.
I don't know the solution to that. And then you've got hydroelectric dams, which you have to dam up and create reservoirs, which can be good things or bad things, also killing a lot of bird habitat. And then you've got these solar reflector things, and they take up a lot of habitat. I mean, miles and miles and miles of solar panel fields take up a lot of habitat, and birds that doesn't leave any place for birds to nest. And anyway, there's always downsides to every technology. I mean, even nuclear power, which I have a funny feeling with 8 billion people approaching that number in the world, we may have to go back to nuclear power. It's just that we got to do it more responsibly and find better ways of storing the waste.
I would agree with you. I think nuclear is probably the way we're going to end up going.
Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's not the way I'd like to go, but you just can't have 8 billion people counting going up to 9 billion people and not have some major ways of giving them electricity. We all need power for our homes and our factories and our farms.
Do you think the population growth poses a significant problem in the West, though? Like, let's say in Canada, does it pose a problem for us?
I still think there's a lot of wide open spaces out here. I mean, I'm not getting the impression that all Canadians want to flee from the East and live in the West or whatever. I mean, it is a great place to live. There's no doubt about it. But I'm not seeing BC being overpopulated at this stage of my life anyway. There's a lot of people want to move to Vancouver and Victoria, the areas where I live. A lot of home building going on there, but I wouldn't say we're, I must say that with the graying of Canadians and people like me, senior citizens, wanting cheaper housing like condos and so on, there's a real propensity for building those. But like I say, we've got to try and find responsible ways to provide electricity. We can't roll the carpet up and expect that no one else can come here. I mean, it'd be very unfair of me to own a house made out of wood and then go ahead and criticize the lumber companies for clear cutting.
Sure, yeah.
It's just that I don't like a clear cut if it's just simply done in a certain way and just leaves a big scar and there's nothing can nest there. But the point is to try and do it responsibly. Try and find ways to do it so that the birds have some place of corridors to move from one place to go to the other, and not just birds but other wildlife too. There are ways to do that, and it's a matter of trying to convince them to avoid just going for the bottom line and saving bucks. Because you see, the thing is, I don't think what I've told my students over the years of teaching, I don't think it's necessarily the 8 billion people that are the problem in the world. It's the nature of humans to be greedy. I think that and this is the thing that bothers me most about the problems facing wildlife around the world is greed. I mean, if you think about even what's going on with the wildlife trade over in the overseas in Asia and Africa and so on, the bushmeat trade, and those are people that do that are basically starving if they don't get money to do that sort of thing. So you can hardly fault them, but there's the market for it, and those are the greedy people that want to make the money from the ivory trade or from pangolins or whatever. And maybe, just maybe, the COVID virus is teaching us all a lesson about these so-called, wet wildlife markets. I've seen them, and they're awful.
Yeah.
I get it that they're, that
you've actually seen them. You've seen the wet wildlife markets, and how are they?
I've been to places like India and Africa, and I've gone to the, down into the markets there, and I've seen animals in small cages, and it's heartbreaking to see. It's
pretty terrible.
Yeah.
It's pretty terrible. I mean, you're a big conservationist, and one of the things that we really need to be careful about is species dying out, or species that are endangered and just becoming extinct. This happened to the passenger pigeon in North America. It was driven to extinction due to hunting. Is there a particular bird species today whose survival that you're particularly worried about?
That's a hard question to ask, because there's 12% of the world's roughly 10,000 bird species are in danger of extinction. And for me to pick out one or two out of all of those 12% of 10,000 is pretty tough. I think that we just had a State of the Birds report done fairly recently in Canada, last couple of years ago, and they have the same thing in the States, and they all come to the same conclusions, that birds of prey and waterfowl are actually doing quite well these days, because we got rid of things like pesticides that were killing off the raptors. And the hunters and the whole hunting fraternity, Ducks Unlimited, for example, are doing wonderful things for protecting ducks. They put a lot of money into it. So it's no wonder they're doing well. I'll tell you, the birds that are not doing so well are the grassland birds, for example, certainly tropical birds, seabirds. We don't quite know where they're standing at, but they're not doing that great in many places. And of course, you've got wetland birds as well, because we're draining all the damn wetlands to build houses and shopping markets and so on. If I had to pick a bird in eastern Canada, I would probably pick a bird I studied for 20 years, the loggerhead shrike. It's a cute little bird that's like a tiny falcon. They actually kill insects, mice, and birds the same size as themselves with their sharp little beaks. That's why they're called butcher birds, because they actually impale these things on barbed wire prongs and hawthorns. And that's where you find them nesting. And they're pretty down violent. In all of eastern Canada, they're down to probably less than 15 pairs. We bred them in captivity, the Band-Aid solution, because the birds, it's the habitat. We actually don't know why they're disappearing. And we had really no business starting up a captive breeding program without knowing the reason why they're disappearing. It's the number one rule for breeding something in captivity. Yeah. And breeding things in captivity is a very expensive solution. It would be better to try and find solutions to keeping the birds around before they get into this kind of state.
So it may not have anything to do directly with man.
Pardon me?
Their disappearance may not have anything to do directly with man-made courses.
Yeah, but I'm almost certain it probably does. Okay. I mean, I have a pet hypothesis for kestrels declining, meadowlarks, and many other insect-eating birds, including loggerhead shrikes, because I think we've been waging war on insects for centuries, and we've been basically using all kinds of chemicals. We've altered their habitats. We've done all sorts of things, and the fact is, in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been some great papers that have just come out showing 40% less insects now than there used to be, not just in Germany, but also in North America too. And so without insects, if you don't have insects, boy, you're not going to have a lot of insectivorous birds.
That's amazing. 40% fewer insect populations. That's insane. You mentioned, by the way, that Ducks Unlimited is one of these organizations that preserves and protects wildlife habitats, especially wetlands and ducks and so on. And I have a great respect for hunters, because I think usually they tend to be big conservationists and fishermen too. I think people who live in cities, people who live in Toronto and Vancouver, don't really understand some of that. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I'd like to ask you, as a conservationist, I mean, there is, I think, irresponsible hunting. There's
Mhm.
irresponsible fishing. Where's the balance for you? What are your thoughts on hunting and fishing?
Well, I think the word is responsible, what you
Yeah.
just used. I mean, I think if you follow the regulations, make sure
Hmm.
you have your permits, make sure that you don't shoot or fish, take more fish than you're supposed to take. And, I mean, in my neighborhood in Sydney, I live in the Gulf Islands, and the orca whales are one population, and the southern population, I believe, is declining seriously. And one of the reasons is because they think there are the Chinook population's been decimated. Not sure 100% why. Could be the recreational fishermen like me. Could be the commercial guys. Could be First Nations. Could be the seals.
Hmm.
Could be something nothing to do with any of that. Could be climate change. But the point is that we've had to shut down the Chinook salmon fishery. And I just, as a fisherman, and I love fishing, I just have to live with it and say, look, the orca's got to live too. It's the same when I go hunting. I hunt these fallow deer on Sydney Island. They're
Hmm.
an invasive European species that have been brought
Yeah.
over. And I don't enjoy the act of actually killing them. It's just that if I do enjoy the act of eating them, and to eat them,
Oh,
I've
they're
got to
so
kill them.
good. They're
And so
so tasty.
my goal there
Yeah.
is to make sure that I humanely kill the
Hmm.
animals, one shot, clean shot, and don't mistreat the animals in any way, and just respect them, much like what indigenous people do in most cases. Um, so um, so I have no problem with hunting. I have a lot of friends who love birds. My
Hmm.
best friend Roger Tippin, who I co-taught ornithology with at McGill University, he loves ducks a lot. He loves looking at them. He studied them all his life, but he also doesn't mind shooting them as well.
Hmm.
And so it's just that he just enjoys being out there with them. And shooting is, he doesn't get a kick out of the actual act of blasting them. It's just that he just likes to be out there. Even if I don't come home with a
Yeah.
deer or I don't come home with the salmon, it's fun. I've been fishing here
Yeah.
for 4 or 5 days in Ferdy with my fly rod, and I haven't caught a trout yet. And so, but it's just being out there.
Yeah.
It's just being out there and enjoying communing with nature.
Yeah, it's a very meditative process. Fishing I've done. I have never done hunting. I'd like to try it, but I also think that even the act of killing the animal, as horrendous as it might be, is much better if you're going to eat it than getting it from a factory farm, which
Well,
treats the
that's
fat.
a good. The fact is, I can appreciate where my food comes from. I've got a freezer dedicated to my deer meat
Hmm.
and all those seafood things I eat, and I know where my food comes from. It doesn't get. Don't get me wrong. I don't mind supporting the beef industry by eating a good steak too. But
Hmm.
I find that there are a lot of people out there who criticize hunters and fishermen for taking from the wild or whatever. Yet they don't seem to understand that when they go to a grocery store, they're taking things too, and
Yeah, exactly.
they're
Yeah.
taking meat and
Yeah.
fish that may be caught under a lot worse
Yeah.
conditions. I've seen some of these cattle farms where the animals are just stuck in little corrals,
Hmm.
or where the fishermen go out there and they use these nets that scrape everything on the bottom of the ocean, and there's a lot of bycatch, and they're killing albatrosses and so on. There's the public have to realize that there's ways of doing things right. And speaking of hunters and fishermen, at least they pay their way. As I'm also a
Hmm.
bird watcher, but I don't have to pay for a bird watching license. And so I'm
No.
going
Yeah.
out there, and even though I'm not taking the birds out of the wild, I'm still going out there and bothering them while they're trying to nest and feed.
Hmm.
And there are instances where people are very unethical birders, and they're few and far between. But the point is, they're still out there. And
Yeah.
so, but we don't pay any permits. So, if bird watchers aren't donating money to the saving of habitat and so on, then they're taking and not giving back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's important to, as you say, be responsible. Now, I'd like to ask Dave if we can move towards the biology of birds, because I know you're also a big researcher, especially on raptors, on birds of prey, and so on. Something that I've noticed about birds, and this could be just my general impression as a layman person who knows nothing really about birds, but it seems like a lot of bird species are monogamous. And there are, I guess, some polyandrous or polygamous bird species.
Yeah. Mhm.
What determines this? What determines a bird's monogamy or polygamy?
Well, that all has to do with evolutionary ecology. I think it comes
Okay.
down to quantity versus quality. There are
Hmm.
some birds out there that feel like you take a red-winged blackbird. I have them. I had them nesting in the backyard of Montreal in an urban situation, a very urban neighborhood,
Hmm.
and you'll only get one male and one female, so quite monogamous. But if you go to a giant marsh, you'll find a male might have several females in a harem, and the
Wow.
females would prefer to be with that male in the harem rather than being with a male by themselves because they're with the guy who's got the best territory. The
Hmm.
fact that he's got a harem means he's got the best territory. And
Interesting.
there are all kinds of crazy things that birds do out there to basically pass on their sperm to the next generation. They want to pass on their genes. And that's what it's all about. I have this talk I give called How Birds Do It. And it's all about the sordid sex lives of birds. It's a bit of a tongue in cheek, but it's all
Yeah.
based on science, all of it.
Okay.
And some of the outstanding things, like here, for example, in Fernie, I've been watching a lot of American redstarts. It's a little black and orange with a bit of white thrown in, warbler, little tiny thing,
Hmm.
fit in your palm of your hand. And the first year males of these birds are disguised as females. They're basically dressed as females, like transvestites.
No
So
way.
that so they can get closer to the females of the dominant males.
Oh, no way.
So
That's
they
so
can sneak in a
sneaky.
copulation here and there and pass on their genes, or also get access to the best food sources. If you want to talk about even more nefarious stuff, you can look
Yeah.
at the ducks.
Yeah.
Ducks were the first to get caught engaging in basically what we biologists call forced copulations, but what society calls rape. There's a lot of
No.
that goes on in the bird world, not just with ducks, but all sorts of birds. And you can tell by the way they do it that the female's not an active participant in the copulation act.
So
But there's
does the rape is that like just one duck, one male duck
no,
that
no. It's
okay.
often, it's sometimes basically a gang. If I can be crude, a gangbang.
Wow.
I have pictures in my talk showing a bunch of male northern rough-winged swallows copulating with a dead male north-winged swallow.
Oh my goodness. That is
And I don't
insane.
ask me, so well, why are they doing that?
Yeah.
And I really don't have an answer for it, but there is a scientific term for it. It's called Davian behavior. And so anyway, it's called Davian behavior. There's a duck out there, for example, called the Argentine stiff-tailed duck that's 16 inches from the tip of its beak to the tip of its tail, and it has an 8-inch long penis. And
Whoa.
and that's
No
not the worst
way.
part. That's not the worst part, Cornelius.
Yeah.
It's covered in spines, big spines.
In spines.
In spines, yes. And so you're saying, well, why would they have that? Well,
Yeah.
it all has to do with the promiscuous behavior of the males. They
Okay.
copulate on the water, and when they're able to subdue a female and get that thing in them, the female can't get it out very easily. And
Yeah,
so
sure.
he's able to stay in her and pump lots of his sperm into her, passing
Whoa.
on his genes.
Dang,
So,
this is aggressive.
yeah, there's all kinds. There's incest out there in the bird world. There's the
Incest.
female incest. Yeah, I mean there are birds, fathers mating with their daughters, grandfathers with their grandsons in various species, and not all species do it.
Yeah.
But if it suits them, to pass on their genes to the next generation, then it becomes part of the genetic makeup of their behavior. That's why some birds are monogamous and
Yeah.
some birds are promiscuous and some birds are polygamous. You
But
have the spotted sandpiper. I just watched some spotted sandpipers this morning. The female is polyandrous, meaning that she is a serial mater of males. She mates with one male,
Yeah.
and then lays eggs for him. He sits on those eggs, and then she goes and finds another male, copulates with him, and lays a set of eggs for him. And she's passing on as many of her genes as possible with as many males as possible.
She's a popular one.
The most promiscuous bird in the world, in my books, is the salt marsh sparrow. They live in a habitat off the Connecticut coast that often floods, and they don't have time to engage in lengthy courtships. So the females mate with any male that comes along. Any male that wants copulation, she mates with them. And
Not
so
particular.
a lot of the broods of these birds are basically fathered by or sired by many males.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, they just don't have time to do the regular courtship thing. So she's not choosy. She said, "Hey, you want to copulate with me? Come along. I'll take your genes. Thank you very much."
I mean, a lot of this behavior seems irregular in a way. I'm just wondering what strategy, monogamy or polygamy, is better suited for the survival of that particular species, or is it very much context dependent? You mentioned the floods, for example, right?
Yeah,
Um, the environment in that case, I guess, is pushing towards a certain
yeah.
type of behavior.
It's
Um,
almost always an adaptation to probably the habitat and the ecology of the habitat they live in. I mean, it's like those salt marsh sparrows. It's like that. The monogamous red-winged blackbirds don't have a huge marsh, so they don't have a huge feeding territory to
mhm.
offer to several females. So they have to adapt. And birds of prey, for example, which I studied for a lot of years, don't engage in what we call extra pair fertilizations as much as other birds do.
Hmm.
But we basically discovered this phenomenon by researchers taking blood samples from the babies in the nest and the mom and dad, and finding out that a lot of the young in the nest, up to 50% in tree swallows, are not sired by the mate looking after them,
So there's
like the father looking
cuckoldry.
after them. And that's not a good thing. You don't want to be
Yeah.
wasting your time looking after
No,
someone else's kids. You want to be looking after the kids that have got your genes in them.
of course. Yeah.
It's what works for them. It's what drives them to do what they do. And any adaptation that comes along into that works, that allows them to produce more offspring, then they've incorporated into their makeup, their behavioral makeup.
So in that particular bird species, cuckoldry is common, and that's just an adaptive
Yeah,
measure. What about
yeah,
incest, though? I mean, incest. You say, okay, we've got to pass on our genes as birds,
yeah.
but incest would seem to corrupt those genes. Am I wrong?
Well, it's something, um, uh, an immediate mating between a father and his daughter, for example, does not necessarily produce deleterious effects. In fact, it might be that the birds that come out there, because the very first pair of kestrels that we banded with little leg bands to identify them were a father and a daughter, and they raised 5 perfectly healthy young. But if those healthy young then also then you start seeing things like impaired fertility, behavioral anomalies, maybe even 3 eyes, 4 wings, or whatever if it gets too crazy. It's just that it's just like continued inbreeding is not good, but a little bit of inbreeding is actually good. So it doesn't mean that all pairs out there are basically inbred among themselves. That's not the case. The way kestrels get around this is when they come back in the springtime, they generally don't come back right to the nest box they were born in. They might come a mile away. But there might be the odd case where they happen not to find anything to breed, like a mate to breed with, and end up where they used to be and end up breeding with their father. But
That's
it's
so
not
messed up.
necessarily a bad thing.
Um, I've got to ask this. As a scientist, when you come to observe birds doing these very strange things like rape or being very cruel, are you ever tempted to kind of impose human morality on them and try to break it up? I mean, I would be tempted to, right?
Cornelius, you're not going to get me into that trap. No, no,
Fair enough. No,
I would
yeah,
never say that, hey, if it's good for the birds, it's good for humans, because we
yeah,
humans are at a different level of evolution than almost
sure,
all wildlife, including even chimps. We've got the ability to reason. We've got, well, I won't say we. I'm sure there are emotions out there. There certainly is in the dog and cat world or whatever.
yeah.
Lots of emotions out there, no doubt about that. But I think the ability to reason is a good thing, and our reasoning is that we have to live by certain societal norms. We can't have people going out there and just raping anybody they want, saying,
No,
yeah, I want to do it because I want to pass on my genes.
no, of
We, we,
course, yeah,
we have alternatives, you see.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so
No,
I would never,
yeah,
never try
no,
to apply what goes on out there. And I mean, if that was the case, then it would be great if, hey, I want what that guy's got, so I'm just going to go and kill him and take it. Or like what lions do, where single male lions, will go and kill the offspring of
yeah.
another guy, so that the female comes into earlier breeding. We just don't do stuff like that.
And thank God we don't. No, the reason
No,
I the
right.
reason I asked that is because my wife and I were on a walk and we saw this brood of ducklings with their mother,
Yep.
and we watched and we saw that there was a stray duckling trying to come into that brood, and the mother
Yes.
attacked it. And then the stray duckling tried to come into the brood again, and then all of the other ducklings descended upon that duckling and tried to kill it. And
Oh,
I told my wife, this is just leave them alone. Things are, we don't want
Yes.
to interfere with things, but she insisted. She went in and she picked that duckling up and put it back
Yeah.
in the pond.
Well, that's all part of
Yeah.
the human quality of sentiment
Yeah.
and so on, and doing something you perceive as right. The fact is I'm actually surprised to hear that, because there are a number of duck species out there that form creches, daycare
Okay.
centers, essentially. There was a famous case actually just recently in the news about a female goose that looked after something like 42 baby goslings, like and brought them almost all of them up to to adult size. And she didn't produce all those goslings. They were probably goslings from other females or whatever, and maybe they lost interest in them, and she ended up taking on the whole darn brood herself. But it was quite unusual, to be honest with you.
That is a bit strange, because I would think that, these ducklings or goslings are trying to compete for limited resources.
Yeah.
And to the extent that the mother is related to her offspring, she wouldn't want stray offspring coming in and getting those limited resources for themselves. So,
Yeah.
what would explain these goslings and these ducks forming daycare centers, as you call them?
Well, I think it's a case of having more eyes for protection against predators, probably more than anything.
Okay.
If you get say mergansers, for example, which are famous for doing these creches, if you get say several females banding together with their young, there's a lot of things that want to eat those little baby ducklings. So by having more than one pair of eyes out there, keeping them all together, then all the better.
Yeah, possibly. That's
Yeah.
interesting, though. I didn't know that they would form daycare centers in that way.
Yeah.
I do have to ask you now. You still publish work, and you're still active in research.
Yeah.
And you've recently started to adopt new technology like UAVs, drones.
Yeah.
What potential do they have to transform ornithology research? I imagine they have substantial potential.
Well, they do actually. I discovered it because I thought, wow, what a great machine to put above a bald eagle nest or a hawk's nest to see
Oh yeah.
how many eggs are in there, how many babies are in there. Are they old enough to climb up to the nest and put little leg identification bracelets on their legs? I discovered that, or felt that, gee, what about putting one up in the air with a radio receiver on it and picking up radio transmission signals from
Cool.
birds that have got transmitters on their backs? Or what about using infrared cameras, for example, and putting them on a machine and flying over the fields and see if you can pick up heat signatures from nesting birds and find out where they are. So that way you can tell the farmers not to run their threshing machines over them. I could go on and on and on, but they have tremendous potential. And to that effect, I actually founded a scientific journal, something not many scientists get to do in their lifetime, called the Journal of Unmanned Vehicle Systems, which is doing very, very well. I'm proud to say that my former PhD student, Dominique Chabot, has taken over the editorship.
Cool.
And it seems to be doing very well. It's still struggling a wee bit because, unfortunately, the regulations just aren't quite there to allow biologists to throw one of these drones up out of sight, over the top of the trees to look for elk or other animals they want to try and find. Right now, the regulations mean you have to keep them within sight at all time. And it's a bit of a limiting factor, but one day there will be things on these machines that will prevent them from, say, colliding with a Cessna jet or a Cessna airplane that's loaded with fishermen or something over the hill. And that will open things up greatly.
Is this journal restricted to biologists and scientists who study nature, or is it because
No,
just
no,
the
not at all.
okay?
No, there are papers in there, Cornelius, that even I didn't understand as an editor. They were filled with mathematical equations and all sorts of physics and stuff like that, which I'm terrible with. And I had this course I had associate editors, as we do today, many associate editors who have specialties in those areas, and they would handle getting them peer reviewed or whatever. But I've been putting on panel reviews and workshops in bird conferences, even other wildlife conferences, and giving talks on drones all over the world in the last dozen years to try and promote their use. And we're getting there in fits and starts, but there are a lot of people out there using them now, for sure.
Yeah, it sounds so logical, right? Just
Yeah,
drones and birds, perfect
yeah.
match, I would imagine. Now we're getting towards the end of our interview. Dave, I've got to ask you, you have a new book out, right? Am I right
Yes.
about that? Yeah.
I'm involved with a company called DK Canada, and they publish 4 books. Every once in a while, they do new editions. And we've done the 2nd edition of the Birds of Canada, which I believe is the one that your wife has looked at. And then there's an offshoot just to make a little bit more money. They've got a smaller version of Birds of Eastern Canada and Birds of Western Canada, in case people don't want to look at 400 and so species in Canada. They just want to look at what's in the West or what's in the East. There is a lot of overlap, by the way. But the book I'm most proud of, and it's just come out only several weeks ago, is Pocket Birds of Canada, which is really, to me, the ultimate field guide to identify birds all across Canada. I know you can buy David Sibley's guides which cover birds of North America, but the point is that then you're wading through about 900 to 1,000 species to try and find out what you're looking at. Whereas if you get a Birds of Canada and you're in Canada, then you cut the list in half right there. It's a great little book. It's well laid out. I'm proud to say that I made some good contributions to it. I'm the consultant editor. I didn't write all of the book. I wrote some of the accounts in there, but I'm very pleased to be part of that team. I'm also part of another company in Quebec called Brome Bird Care. And if people are interested in getting answers to bird questions, they can go on Google Brome Bird Care, actually Brome Bird News, and you'll find every 2 weeks we do a show, and I'm on as a guest there, like a guest expert, answering questions about birds and giving bird reports. And so it's something I've been doing for I guess about 3 years now. And if I can put out a couple of more interesting things for you very quickly.
Yeah, please do.
We haven't mentioned cats. And
Cats.
Cats eat or cats kill. I'm talking about free-ranging cats.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
Outdoor cats of any kind, feral or pets. They're killing over 2 billion birds every year in the U.S. Comparable numbers for Canada and also for overseas in Europe. And it's something we can fix. That's a lot of birds.
Yeah.
That's almost approaching 2.5 billion birds in the U.S. alone. And the way to fix it is to keep the cats under control.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting people have to put them on a leash and whatever, but certainly don't let them outside during fledging season.
Yeah.
Because cats will kill whether you feed your cat well or not. They like to do it for fun. And so my big message to everyone is the next time you get a cat, make it an indoor cat right from the get-go. And that'll help solve the problem. It's an intergenerational solution. And the other thing I want to leave you with is that I also had a team called Team Canada Jay, and the Canada Jay is the bird we'd like to see as the national bird of Canada. And in fact, we are creating a website right now on that, and also writing a book as a promotional tool to convince the federal government to make it an official bird of Canada, the Canada Jay. It's a bird that doesn't migrate, so it's tough. It breeds in the middle of winter and sometimes 30 degrees below zero. It's a very monogamous species. It's very intelligent, part of the crow family. It's found in every province, every territory, all across Canada. And there are many other attributes. It's a fantastic bird. It's almost unbeatable. And we actually got the name changed from Gray Jay, which it won in a contest about 3 to 4 years ago. It won a popularity contest as Gray Jay. If it had been named Canada Jay, it would have come in first. But the federal government has to recognize this and make it law.
A hardy bird for a hardy nation, I guess, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not to mention intelligent.
An intelligent bird as well, for an intelligent
and tough.
And tough.
Yeah.
By the way, you have a website. It's Ask Professor Bird, right?
Yes, it's www.askprofessorbird.com. And there's an email, an opportunity to ask me questions. I answer everybody. Sometimes I might even take the question and use it for a Brome Bird News pod. But I enjoy public outreach very much. That's why I'm enjoying being on your show, Cornelius. Thank you very, very much for having me.
I really enjoyed this too. I find this fascinating. And, the way you put this across, I can imagine that you must have been a really great teacher as well. So I really appreciate you for coming on. Thank you for joining me, Professor Bird. Dave.
Thank you very much, Cornelius.